Okay, so the first player I want to talk about as a potential big value in redraft leagues for 2024 is my running back on today's show. And he is a guy who was supposed to be a top 10, potentially top 5. Hell, this guy could be running back 1 overall in 2023. None of that stuff really panned out, but I do have some explanations as to why that might have been. But my guy at the running back position, who could be a big, big, big value in redraft formats this season, is Tony Pollard. Tony Pollard played for the Dallas Cowboys his entire career up through now. This offseason, he just signed on with the Tennessee Titans, and we will talk about his situation here in a minute. So, like I said this time last year, Tony Pollard, he was being hyped up big time. Like, I heard people saying he's got wide receiver, running back 1 overall upside. He's definitely going to be top 5, top 10 at the worst. He was drafted on average as the RB8 overall in 2023, and he ended up finishing as the RB14. So you think about it, hey, on the worst case scenario, he's going to be, running back 10, top 10 guy. He finished as running back 14, just 4 spots out of that, just 2 spots out of a running back 1. Like, it really wasn't that bad of a season for Tony Pollard. It was just not the season that people expected. It just didn't live up to the hype. That was the only thing. And it just didn't feel, though, and it was based on all that hype, but you just didn't feel, if I was a Tony Pollard manager. And I didn't feel like he was in that RB1 range as I was playing him most of the time, but there's a reason for that, and that's because even though he finished the season as the 14th best running back in total points in fantasy football, he finished as running back 23 in points per game, just 13.1. So that means he was barely a running back 2 on a consistency basis in points per game for your team. So that's more like what you were feeling if you rostered Tony Pollard in 2023. So the narrative last year, we'll just kind of do a little backtracking here. Backfield all to himself. He's the lead running back for the first time in his career. No more Ezekiel Elliott. Pollard was like the RB. I think he was a top 10 or top 15 running back the year before with Zeke there in limited roles. So now it's like, hey, sky's the limit and all this stuff. And now, you go a year ahead here and he's with the Tennessee Titans. And that's an offense that, if you ask anybody, it's being perceived as very much worse than what the Cowboys offense is. But much worse for whom is the question. So in Dallas, let's just think about this for a second. The offense moved over the course of the season last year in 2023 to a much more pass-heavy attack over the course of that season. In Tennessee, the offense has historically been run-heavy. But that was with Derrick Henry, which made sense, and not very good wide receivers or quarterback play or anything like that. Now we've got a new head coach, Brian Callahan, the former offensive coordinator from the Cincinnati Bengals, is coming over to head coach Tennessee. Now the offense may not be as run-centric as it has been, but I seriously doubt they're going to, at the same time, just let Will Levis go out there and rip it 40-plus times a game. In the head coach's rookie season, it's only year 2 for Levis. They're not throwing this guy to the wolves. They want him to be successful, so they're going to be smart with how they deploy this offense. But I do believe that this offense is going to be a little more balanced. They brought in Tyler Boyd. They brought in Calvin Ridley, both coming in to pair up with DeAndre Hopkins is still there. They still have Kyle Phillips, if you remember him. Now, he can be a useful real-life wide receiver, but not really worth anything mentioning past this in fantasy. And they've got Chiga Okonkwo at tight end. And now they've got Tony Pollard in the backfield. But the thing is, he's alongside Tyjae Spears, the rookie from last year. I think he was 3rd-round rookie. So, will Tyjae Spears and Tony Pollard be splitting work in 2024? Yeah, I think they absolutely will be. The question now is, when has Tony Pollard been the most productive for fantasy football? When he split a backfield. So I think that splitting a backfield, now we talk all the time in fantasy, volume is king. You want players who get the most volume as possible. But for Tony Pollard, I think less volume might be better because he's very efficient and he's not built to be a high volume guy. So I think Tony Pollard has a lot of fantasy potential this year, even in a split backfield with Tyjae Spears. And notice I have not even yet mentioned the injury for Tony Pollard. So Tony Pollard broke his leg late into the 2022 season toward the end, and we know it takes quite a bit of time for these guys to come back fully from these leg injuries, ACLs and broken legs and what have you. So I feel like Pollard last year was hampered by the injury. I think he has even alluded to or even just straight out said as much. And even with the lack of efficiency, the recovering from injury, and all that kind of stuff, the pass-heavy attack in Dallas, Tony Pollard still put up 1,000 yards rushing and 311 yards receiving. So he had 13 total yards and 6 rushing touchdowns. His production essentially was just killed by his inefficiency in the red zone. I'd have to pull up the stats, but he did not do very well in the red zone last year. And he also caught a grand total of 0 touchdowns through the air. Now you add on a couple receiving touchdowns, maybe a couple more rushing touchdowns through his red zone work, and now last year all of a sudden looks a little bit different. So in 2022, the year before, in one fewer game and on 59 fewer carries, Tony Pollard actually had the same amount of yards and 3 additional rushing touchdowns as a timeshare back than what he did in 2023 as the main bell cow in Dallas. His career yards per game was well over 5 yards per... His career yards per carry was over 5 yards per carry for his career until this past season. It dropped down to 3.99, just under 4. Now, I mentioned this already. He's not a bell cow back, but he doesn't need to be. Like I said, in order to produce for fantasy, he is much more efficient on fewer touches because he's not built to handle a high volume. Tennessee also beefed up their offensive line. They added Brian Callahan's dad, Bill Callahan, as the offensive line coach. Being a Cleveland Browns fan, I can tell you that's a pretty big deal. He revamped our offensive line in a big way, and I think he's going to do the same thing in Tennessee. Again, they added legit wide receiver weapons. And Will Levis was not some bum prospect. I mean, he was talked about with the top quarterbacks in his class, so he was just a little more raw quarterback. Scouts said he's going to need time to develop, but I say all that I think this offense could surprise some people. I think it's going to be a lot better than many people expect, and I'm not calling for like a top 10 offense in the NFL or anything like that, but I think for fantasy football, I think there could be some great values in the Tennessee Titans offense. I'm not worried about Tyjae Spears. He was not drafted by this new regime that they just hired all these new guys in this year. And if you look at what the team has done, what was the very first thing that this new regime, this new staff did in free agency? They immediately brought in their guy at the running back position. Tony Pollard was one of the first guys they signed. Coach speak, the coach is saying these guys are viewed as 1A, 1B in the backfield, and honestly, I don't care about that. I want Pollard in a timeshare. I do. He's one of the few backs. Like I said, I don't want him being a bell cow. I don't want him getting 20 carries a game. I want him getting 10 to 12 carries a game, and I want him to get in targets in the passing attack. So he is much more explosive for fantasy football if he's being utilized that way. He is being drafted currently as the RB23. We're heading into June, so just keep that number in mind. RB23, which is, again, where he finished in fantasy points per game. But at that price point, this is why he's a value. I am all in on Tony Pollard at RB23 because I'm not saying that he's going to be like an RB1 for your roster. But, man, I think Tony Pollard could prove to be a reliable RB2 with, like some high-end RB2 upside, maybe getting into that, 13, 14, 15, running back range this season. Where he's being drafted, you got guys like Ramondre Stevenson, DeAndre Swift, Javonte Williams, Austin Eckler. Seriously, give me Pollard over all those guys because there's a lot of uncertainty around each one of those guys. And with Tony Pollard, his team actively and new coaching staff actively invested in him this offseason. And he's going to be now a full year removed from that leg injury, fully recovered. And I just think that it's going to be wheels up for Tony Pollard. So again, like I talked earlier about the Nico Collins stuff, if you go wide receiver heavy early, if you take a high-end quarterback early, if you take a tight end early, and you kind of wait on running back a little bit, I would not be relying on Tony Pollard as my RB1. But if you're going to go with like a hodgepodge mix of running backs to kind of rotate throughout your roster during the season, I strongly recommend looking at Tony Pollard to be part of that hodgepodge.